You are listening to a discussion born in the Christian Ghetto. And we're recording. Very good. Welcome, gentlemen. So we're here to talk about the Texas border situation, in part from a Christian perspective, but also broadly just politics for the sake of politics, but how to understand this crisis, as Christians. And I think somebody dropped out. I really enjoyed the review you had, Charles, from on Basil's parody. But I thought it would be good for you to make that case yourself in regards to the notion of our current immigration as an inversion of Christian charity, maybe just to get us kicked off and rolling that way.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I recently reviewed a compilation of four and a half, because one of the fifth sermon that's probably what they call pseudo-Basilian, that is written by someone else. So 4 sermons of St. Basil the Great, who lived in the 4th century and is one of the greatest saints, particularly in the Orthodox tradition, but is recognized as a saint by the Catholics and so on. So this compilation of 4 sermons is unfortunately titled On Social Justice, which is not a term that Basil used or that he would have had any truck whatsoever with the modern conception of social justice. But it's kind of a companion piece to a similar compilation of sermons that's also issued by St. Vladimir's Press by St. John Chrysostom, who's another contemporaneous preacher saint. And the focus in both these cases is on what is the duty of a Christian with respect to the distribution of wealth. The focus is on rich people or rich men in general. Chrysostom focuses on the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, and Basil focuses on probably the other parable, the people, in this case actually story, not parable, that comes to mind from Scripture, which is Christ's admonition to the rich young man when asked if he would be perfect, what he should do. And the answer was, follow my commandments. And having done that, the answer is, if you would be perfect, sell what you have and give it to the poor. So over time, and this is today's book, in the early church, there was a lot of discussion about what these parables and this story of Christ's life meant, ranging from, well, this is a counsel of perfection where the main focus should be not letting your mind as a rich person be occupied with focus on wealth, to St. Basil, who's kind of the extreme, where he basically says that if you have more than anybody else, you're a thief and a murderer. I mean, it's a little bit extreme, not quite that close, but he basically says, he interprets the story of Christ not as an admonition that if you really want to be perfect, you can do this for the maximum, but as a requirement of basic charity, love for your neighbor, which is, as we know, the second greatest commandment. And so Basil goes on in great length in the context of a famine in Caesarea, where he was a priest and later bishop, about how everybody who is rich, meaning he came from a rich background himself, he doesn't define rich, but he basically means anybody who has more than the desperately poor, need to give. If you fall short of everything, you're basically slapping Christ in the face and you're a loser. I mean, that's basically the way he puts it. These sermons are actually interesting because they're very contemporaneous in the sense that they even have asides. Like he has this aside at one point, like, why are so few people coming to listen to me? And the people who are here are yawning. What the hell? Basically, it's almost 2,000 years and you can kind of get that sense. But so this is a very interesting thing. But one of my points in my analysis of this was that Basil's poor were very different from our poor. And I don't mean this, I'm hesitant to go down this path somewhat because it's easy for people to then adopt the neocon Heritage Foundation approach of, well, poor people need to get a job. And it's obviously not that simple. But on the other hand, Basil goes on at great length about how, for example, he paints this picture of why the rich need to give, because in a poor family, the father has to decide which of his children to sell to the slave market. And that you, as the person not preventing that from happening, are guilty, which is a lot more powerful than you, the person who's not giving money to the person who gets a free $1,000 iPhone from the government just for being poor, are guilty. I mean, these things are not equivalent. And we're getting to the immigration part. One of the other points I made was that very frequently people think that admitting migrants and I use the term migrants not in its kind of leftist sense of an euphemism for illegal alien, but rather for migrant, meaning an alien who is here, who has come here legally. Or
yeah, I think migrant is the better term, because whether they're legal or illegal is kind of irrelevant to the discussion.
Absolutely, totally. I mean, certainly illegal have an easier mechanical path to remove, but I mean all people who should not be here or should be considered whether they should be allowed to be here. People assume that allowing migrants is charitable in St. Basil's sense, whereas the exact opposite is the case, because you can expand this discussion at some length, but basically we don't have equal obligations of charity to everybody all around the world. That would have been completely bizarre to Basil, who even giving charity to people in another city would have been completely bizarre. He meant that we owed charity to the people that we see in the streets, in the streets of Caesarea, in his case. And those are our primary responsibility because they're our primary loves. And the idea that we would give money to foreign countries, for example, to alleviate their problems would have been strange to him. And the idea that we would admit people from foreign countries who harm the people who are already here by depressing wages, taking tax dollars, and so on, he would have regarded as completely bizarre. So my point is that we have this distorted and twisted sense of what's charity relative to what the church fathers would have said.
Charles, do you think that that's related to a more found lesser in Protestant circles, but bishops and locality? In other words, that the church was local, and therefore the charity was literally who God brought into your sphere of influence, or your who you just encountered.
Well, I'm interpolating a little bit in the sense that Basil doesn't say any of those things that I just said because they were outside of his ken. That is, I'm trying to kind of map some of his principles as the most, for lack of a better word, extreme advocate of extreme charity. St. Clement, for example, who was another church father, took a much more relaxed tack. And so it's hard for me to say, these things are in a sense counterfactuals because St. Basil is not here, or rather, he is here. He's not speaking to us directly. So it's an attempt to map onto current things some of these principles.
Well, I think the point you made in the book review was excellent, that the idea that we would show more compassion to the migrants than to our own people is an inversion of charity, actually. So we bring in these people who are then undermining the prosperity and lives of our people in the name of compassion. So we are being uncompassionate and harsh to our own people in the name of compassion for the migrant, for the outsider.
Well, and I think all this has to come back to 1 Timothy, where there's this admonition that if any man fails to provide for his own family, he's worse than an unbeliever. So there's very, very clearly in Scripture this idea of a primary responsibility, first to your family, then to your church, then to your broader community, before people who are, disconnected to you by all the sort of unchosen bonds that are placed in your life. And I think at the root of this kind of telescopic charity problem is the sort of liberal assumption that unchosen bonds are arbitrary and therefore to be kind of torn down or ignored.
Well, but I also think this notion of like Kantian ethics, that all ethical rules, in order for them to be properly ethical, have to be universal. In other words, they're applicable everywhere at all times. And I think one of the points I want to make later will revolve around the fact that the idea of a universal ethic is mistaken and would be largely unrecognizable, say, in an earlier medieval church. But maybe before we go deeper, that we just have Josh maybe introduce and explain to us the situation in Texas on the ground and give us maybe a little bit of deeper understanding of kind of what's going on there.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll keep this relatively brief. We could get into any number of details around the situation, but I think that what's going on is something that you could call, it's akin to a sovereignty contestation in some ways, but there are sort of two different fronts right now as I see it. The first one is this Texas law that was passed about 2 weeks ago now called SB 4. This law tracks federal law with respect to individuals who are present in the state in violation of our immigration law. And the real cash out of that law is that it allows state law enforcement to detain illegal immigrants. And the Department of Justice has now sued Texas over these laws, seeking an injunction against them being enforced. And this will no doubt make its way up to the Supreme Court. These Texas laws are very similar in many respects to a set of similar laws that were passed by Arizona back in 2011, which the Supreme Court struck down in that case. And so anyways, this is one front, the Texas laws, SB 4. The second front is that at the end of last week, the Texas government appears to have physically removed and blocked federal border patrol agents from a portion of the border called Eagle Pass. This has been a hot spot for years, and certainly has been in the recent crisis. And just to say a word about the scale of the crisis, perhaps people hear this all of the time, but in 23. The Department of Homeland Security said that there were over 3 million encounters with illegal immigrants at the border. Now, that's just encounters. They estimate that they only encounter something like 78% of the total number of people crossing. So the total number is higher than the number encountered. And of course, in that number, there are all of your standard sort of Central American migrants, which we've seen for many years. And then there were over 50,000 Chinese nationals encountered crossing the border in 23, a whole range of other people from all over the world. And in fact, some confirmed cases of spies, suspected terrorists, and all of the rest. So people can get bored about the scale of this crisis and hearing about it over and over again, but it's gotten markedly worse every single year under the Biden administration. And now it would appear that each year we're probably well above 1% of the nation's population crossing the border.
Now, does it seem like the Texas Takeover is having any successes in terms of stemming that tide at all?
This is an extremely perilous moment for the Abbott administration. It's far too soon to say, on the whole, whether or not they're slowing down the tide or if they're just pushing people to other portions of the border. There have still been crossings in Eagle Pass, and this is the just unfortunate reality. It's a very difficult situation for Abbott because it will be discovered very quickly, probably already has been discovered, that Texas law enforcement will not be shooting. And that being the case, what appears is happening is, Texas law enforcement are trying to maintain the integrity of the border with riot shields, and they're getting bull rushed, and people who break through the shield wall just walk right into the country with a grin on their face. So I think it's going to become very, very clear very soon that actually Texas is no better situated than the federal government to stop these people unless they're willing to use lethal force. However, that's a perilous proposition because the entire border, of course, is crawling with reporters and NGOs who are sitting ready to blow up the very first fatality into a sort of a national crisis and flashpoint. And the Abbott administration, no doubt, is aware of that. And if that were to occur, it would open up an entirely new and very unpredictable front. It's a step that I think the Abbott administration is going to be very hesitant to take. And
just to be clear, the reason why you could not successfully stem this tide with detentions rather than with the use of force on the border itself is that if you detain these migrants, they drop into the DHS system and get released into the interior. Is that correct?
Yes, under the current regime, they do. SB4 and its effect. I mean, that does represent an attempt on the part of Texas to actually detain itself rather than giving handing these people over to the feds for detention.
Well, all these things, it seems to me, are features, not bugs, because crises and flashpoints are good. That is, if you're abstracting it, doesn't necessarily mean this. If you oppose the current system, crises and flashpoints are good because your enemies have to tamp everyone down, and you only have to have one split everything wide open. So, I don't know. I know nothing about Abbott's thought process or what have you, but what's unclear, of course, the historical path is that there's something that the NGOs and reporters can use to gin up a fake crisis, like they did with George Floyd, for example. They're used to people following the approved moral path they set out. But if the people don't, then we get more of the same, which is an affirmative good.
Well, the issue here, as you point out, Charles, is that there's an opportunity here for Abbott to act if he wants to, right? He could very clearly make a hard break with the Biden administration on an issue that's probably popular in Texas, right? So if Abbott is able to garner support sufficient within Texas for taking more extreme actions at the border, he probably could. He has an opportunity to substantially increase his power. Let's put it that way.
Right, but I mean that's kind of an abstraction. It seems to me the obvious set of plays is that, as Josh mentioned, the federal government has gone in for an injunction against SB4 and has also gone in for an injunction, I believe, against the activity in Eagle Pass. So they either will or they won't get that injunction. And the sad fact is that if they do get an injunction, Abbott will probably comply. But if he didn't comply, yes, I mean, in a sense, it would increase his power within Texas, but that just spins the question forward. Because if he fails to comply, then the federal government's next obvious play, unless they're complete losers, is to arrest Abbott.
That's correct. You're setting up an escalating confrontation.
Right.
That's right.
And the question is whether Abbott et al. Are prepared for that confrontation, whether this is the right ground to make that confrontation on, all of those issues. I think it's fair to say that the crisis at the border is certainly a favorable ground for Abbott to take that confrontation on compared to some of the other options that exist confronting the federal government. But certainly it's a non-trivial issue to make the choice to escalate a confrontation with the U.S. feds.
Is Abbott a lawyer by background?
Yes.
Probably. I don't know.
Right. So that will happen because lawyers, by their very nature, and by their training, will not do such a thing. I would be shocked if Abbott doesn't back down. That's unfortunate. Well.
It's a CYA business.
Basically, I mean, but it's also like lawyers self-select for risk aversion, and that's reinforced in their training and so on. I don't know what his background is, but and he probably surrounds himself with lawyers. So, unfortunately, we're probably not going to get anything good out of this. But who can tell?
Well, I mean,
but at the same time,
if you compare and contrast to the sovereignty crisis in Western Canada, where the Western Canadian provinces are dominated by oil tycoons that are much more prepared to exert sovereignty against the federal government, seek confrontation. The character of the people involved is very important.
Yes.
If Abbott were former military, you'd have the area cleared, and then the press aren't an issue as much. I mean, you just turn it into a military operation area, and then if something cooks off, it's more easily contained. Instead, what you've created is a public relations. It's a politician and a lawyer, but that's we're seeing what the next round of great men need to be is versed in these other areas of conflict.
Yeah, Ron, you might remember a couple of years ago that picture of the mounted Texas National Guard chasing people at the border and what that was turned into in the media.
Right.
You just don't want those pictures out there.
I suspect that things like that are getting diminishing returns. That is, the part of the reason I like this, even if Abbott is unable to hold the course, is that every time this happens, we get a little bit stronger because more normal people stop caring. Like we had another George Floyd type thing. I doubt very much you could pull off another Summer of Floyd kind of thing. There's a lot of people who'd be like, that guy's a scumbag, piss on him. So we'll see. But I think, as Lennon said, the worse, the better.
Yeah. Well, this is
and-
right. This comes down to the question of, do you really care enough? Do you really care about removing the regime, or do you just care about being more comfortable?
Sure.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
I was going to say, to his credit, Abbott did take the step of ejecting the federal border enforcement. So there is a sense where even as a cautious lawyer, he's gone farther probably than many expected him to go. So
That's true.
And so how far? So you actually here have 2 points of conflict, right? So you have the migrants coming across the border, and there's that sort of sense, okay, 1 or 2 migrants, that's a fine thing. So at what point does a flood of migrants become an invasion, but without a military back? You know what I mean? So do you classify it rather we're being invaded rather than it's just a group of helpless migrants coming across the border? And then the other side is the conflict with the federal government, that the migrants are the reason and justification, but you have almost 2 separate conflicts here. And so there is the question of, do you threaten force against the migrants? Like Ron says, just clear the area out, just let them know if somebody comes across the border, this is what is going to happen, and then you follow through on it if it does. Which is, it's ugly, but at least, you do your best to make sure that the images aren't being splashed on the television screens.
The modern populace has little understanding of the difference between regular and irregular forces. And that's part of the issue too. I don't think many of these folks are armed, if any. That's not the issue. But it is, if it were my deal, the facilitators would be the targets of any force. That's an easier legal argument to make, whereas the people would not. Detention, do what you need to do there, but the facilitators, be they coyotes, verifiable traffickers, drug agents, they would be easily justified legal targets of lethal or sublethal force.
Now, that's a good distinction to make, though, too, Ron, because a lot of these people get caught up in these things, and then many of them are like sold into slavery once they get here as well, too, right? So that's the other thing.
Yes.
So they are traveling across the border illegally. There is a certain degree of victim status to them, but many of the facilitators also, and the more powerful ones, remain on the other side of the border where they're somewhat out of reach, right? And then you get into the whole, do you do the black ops thing, right?
The state has no ability to do that. That's where the feds have complete, have the states under their arm, so to speak, or under their, boot. You can't even. We patrol the Texas border with aerostats, for instance, mainly aerostats, the large balloons that are tethered. The state can't put one of those up because it would have to ask the FAA for permission. So you can't fly a drone, obviously, along the border in case it actually, veers off a bit. Now you've got an international incident, although I don't know how much power Mexico has in real terms. So, but this is where the state all it has is the ability to police in a police action, even if it's National Guard. It just has these policing capabilities. It can't do the next level kind of thing.
Ron, just the bottom line, you can't, without grabbing substantial sovereignty from the feds, you can't confront this issue. So you're going to confront the federal government and say we're going to grab sovereignty, or you're not. And Abbott is right at the edge of that. There's one decision or the other.
Exactly right. this is a point I've tried to make in print and in other appearances, but Abbott is aided in that effort by very decent hooks in our own political tradition. So he's not inventing this whole cloth. The first thing is, of course, I mean, this is the point of the article that I wrote last week, but just pay attention to what our own political tradition says about what a state is. I mean, we say that states are sovereigns, dual sovereigns in our system with the federal government. Our political tradition has long recognized their ability to exclude, and this concept of having the right to exclude is one of the core features of sovereignty. Scalia, in his dissent in the Arizona case, he literally says, the majority is depriving Arizona of a core aspect of their sovereignty. And so partly, we can tell Abbott, who is a lawyer, we can say, just read what we say. And what does that actually mean? What does a sovereign do when someone tries to deprive them of a core aspect of their sovereignty, right? So that's one. But then the other one is specifically on this point, Ron, that you mentioned about, causing an incident with Mexico or what have you. This one has expressed constitutional language. States generally are not supposed to make war. Of course, that we understand why that would be a federal function in general. But I mean, this has explicit constitutional language that says a state cannot make war unless it is being invaded. And so this invasion concept has a textual hook in the Constitution. And I would suggest, I suspect that the Abbott administration is, among other things, building a record to support the fact of an invasion, which then, of course, ends up being helpful in lawfare, but also helpful with public perception.
Yeah, I mean, I really think you have to pull not on the U.S. Constitution, but on a deeper and sort of more ancient idea of the responsibility of a sovereign. Right. A sovereign has the responsibility to provide law and order to his citizens. And if the federal government fails to fulfill its responsibility as a sovereign, somebody else, either you're just going to suffer or somebody else is going to grab that baton and run with it.
So I agree. I agree with that observation, but I would say that to the extent that you can make that observation and dress it in hooks from our own political tradition, the Constitution, and our political history, you're on high.
There's some value in there.
Popular constitutionalism in America remains extremely powerful with public perception.
I think one of the problems that we face here is that it's extremely difficult to predict what the federal government will do because of the incompetence and stupidity of the people they're in. That is, historically, you could look and say Richard Nixon and the people who surrounded him. And you could, I don't know what it would be necessarily, not being an expert on that era, but you could probably say these people know ABC, they say XYZ, therefore the result is likely to be PDQ. Right now, it's just a grab bag of pickup sticks, right? If Abbott gives the finger to some judicial decision, the federal government could do everything from nothing because it's an election year and they'll just chant white supremacy and use it in ads, or they'll drop thermobaric bombs on Eagle Pass. I mean, who knows, right? It could be anything, right? Because some low IQ affirmative action 24-year-old hire decided to do it.
Well, and Charles is right that the federal government hasn't been challenged from the right domestically in a very long time. There's no obvious string of precedents as to what it would do. Yeah.
So, I mean, I of course, I'm an optimistic guy that it'll do the wrong things and will do the things, but
escalate it. It's one of the things that too, I think that would be helpful, I think, for our listeners, once this gets posted, is to maybe frame some of this theologically. Because in a sense, one of the problems that many Christians run into is this, because they're working in a framework of Kantian ethics and universals, they sort of see, well, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt have compassion on the poor, these types of things. And they apply it everywhere equally. And they don't understand something that was very apparent to somebody in even the first century, all through the Middle Ages, is that different roles in society have a different set of rules. So in a sense, the magistrate operates by a different set of rules than you as the citizen does, and has a different set of obligations to you as a citizen, but also to God that you do, right? And one of those obligations is, or the privileges and obligations, is the use of violence in the defense of order. And what is it that Paul says, to maintain, to punish the evildoer, but there's also a sense of protecting the citizen, right? So there's a whole series of obligations that on the one hand, our federal government has failed at, right? Now, Calvin talks about in the Institutes, he talks about how, the Lord declares that the magistrate is a calling from God. So there is this sense that being put in this position can be viewed from, at least from a Calvinist perspective, as a calling from God, so that the use of violence to protect the society, the use of violence to maintain order, are all parts of, in a sinful world, the calling of God, right? But there's also an interesting little passage, and this would maybe go to Abbott's in Book 4, Chapter 10, sections 30 and 31, 32, right at the very end of Calvin's Institutes, where he talks about the lower magistrate, because he has an obligation to his own people, right, that's God-given, has an obligation to rebel against the superior authority. So let's say you're a count.
This is the same fight over what Romans 13 really means that's been going on ever since the start of, ever since COVID hit us in 2020.
That's exactly it. And Calvin argues that the lower magistrate has an obligation to God and his people to rebel against the higher authority when the rule of the higher authority is unjust, as in a sense that he's a form of judgment against the higher authority. And so he has to put himself, in terms of violence and so forth, in the way. So this is, in a sense, from for those who are thinking about it from a Christian perspective, this is a very long-standing tradition that Calvin draws on of, the lower magistrate having our rule isn't determined. You don't get your justification from your rule from the people. You get it from God. And so you have an obligation from God to stand up for justice and order and uprightness in your society, in your community. And if the federal government is preventing that, you have an obligation of God to rebel against that. And that's kind of, I think. Yeah,
there's there's very much a historic federalism within the scriptural tradition across Christian traditions, especially in Orthodoxy and in Protestantism, I think is fair to say.
I think that's right. But
it gets back to that locality of the church and bishops or presbyteries in our case.
But I mean, I think in terms of its applied politics today, people just assume without discussion, leaving aside the question of specifically who the decision maker is at the levels that we're talking about, that a Christian owes charity to somebody in Venezuela. I don't think that any Christian in America has any obligation whatsoever to anybody in Venezuela, whether to let them come here, to help them in any way, shape, or form, because there are enormous amounts of people here who need our help. Not a single dollar from America, from private or public, should go anywhere for the most part. I mean,
and I think, Charles, further to that point, most congregations don't actually they have Christian obligations to the people who have been part of their community for generations, and not the people the federal government dropped on their front doorstep yesterday, right?
Well, that's true, but there is a wrinkle. There's two wrinkles that I can think of with this. Let's taking Venezuela, because there's lots of Venezuelans. First of all, there's the Great Commission, right? There's something to be said for sending missionaries and spending money for missionaries to go to Venezuela or any other place. And that does tend to bleed into local charity and so on. So there is an element of that. And obviously there's national security things. That is, if we want to spend money on interfacing with the Venezuelan Navy, if Venezuela has a Navy, I assume they do, maybe that's money that gets ultimately spent in Venezuela. But we're continuously, and this is a fault of the British Victorians, the idea, basically where women in the Victorian era decided that the poor little children in Africa were the place that Britain should spend all its money, rather than the poor little children in Britain. And so we're still living with the results of this basically feminized way of looking at the world. That is, all the little children need help from all of us, and we'll just ignore the local people because really it's more virtuous to help the little black children in Africa.
Well, and building upon that, the missionaries were to go, the distinction that you make is fantastic, because it's the missionary's job to go and change the other. It's not the dollar's job to go and change the other. It's the missionary and the local prophet who gives them eyes to see that which can be better, gives them a new vision, so to speak. That's not the job of money, so to speak. That's the mission.
But even the money, like Basil would say, you should give away most of your money. But
but that's local.
Right, exactly.
Right?
I mean,
right.
You're absolved from giving away your money. But because the costs, anything given to Venezuelans necessarily in that context, if you're going to give away X dollars, comes at the cost of the people here who need it, the Venezuelans should be ignored.
And not only is it local, there's an order in Scripture of this. First to your family, then to your church, then to your wider community. But until you can say that the poor within your church are properly cared for, the poor within your family are properly cared for, gives a shit.
Black horse. Yeah, better a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away.
Yeah, I think you quoted that one earlier today, Ron. That's a good passage to remember that way. I think, as this thing gets escalated, I mean, this is really the kind of the hard reality, I think, that most of us see, but nobody really kind of wants to talk about it, is there a way to solve the migration problem or crisis, without violence? And that's, I think, really the big question is can it be done anymore at this point? And was the point of this from a propaganda perspective? And this is one of the things that Jacques Ellul notes, is that, you try to put yourself into a position from a propaganda perspective that it doesn't matter what happens, which avenue events go to, that you can successfully propagandize it either way. So if the border stays open, it's great for the regime. If you have to take violent action, and there is, like, even if it's just, you're trying to target it to the coyotes and the people responsible for bringing people over, there's going to be collateral damage, right? And so the regime is saying, well, if there's collateral damage, that's good, because then we can hammer our enemies on this issue, and either way it works out well for us, right? And so there has to be, I think, a certain sense where, are we, not just as a nation, but even as a Christian community, prepared to say that we give our blessing to our leaders to do the hard things it needs to do, because our own community is suffering and dying here?
I also think this speaks to the kind of lack of virtue in a lot of American communities. So traditionally, when the sovereign carries out his appropriate function of violence, whether, for example, in executing criminals, the whole community gathers together and applauds when the hangman's noose drops, right? This is a totally foreign concept to most people who have been enculturated in the West, because they've come to think that exercising violence on behalf of justice makes you bad, basically.
Well, and the migration thing is unfortunately, there is no universal, like the one you outlined, where the sovereign, whether that's Trump or the existing regime or what have you, decides to take any significant set of the necessary actions to stop this. Therefore, it's all wrapped up in what might be called the Gordian Knot of all the present troubles. And really, to fix the immigration problem, you either have to, you have one of two possible paths at the highest level: continued economic reasonable stability and economic instability, leading all the way potentially to economic collapse. The latter path is actually a much easier way to solve migration, because people will self-select not to hang around in a place where they can't get gibs and phones and so on. If the economy manages to stagger on for another 20 years, that's the problem, because the regime is less likely to collapse in that scenario, and there's no universe in which anything can actually be done about immigration short of some kind of
total regime change.
Well, or perhaps brought on by or working in parallel with some kind of ascending spiral of the type that is possible but unlikely with this current situation with Abbott in Texas.
Well, it's interesting, like Black Horse's point that he makes about violence and justice in society is a good one, because one of the things that in the West, especially as we have gravitated towards this idea of democracy, the marketplace of ideas, is that countries can be run like businesses through contract negotiation and so forth. So the idea is that we have come to think of societies being founded on negotiation and talking rather than on violence, right? And in a sinful world, in order to establish a state, you establish a state by violence. So what we tend to do is the violence that has to happen in society, we tend to push it out of sight. So rather than giving 20 lashes or whatever, cutting somebody's hand off or whatever, we put people in prison. And so we have thousands upon thousands of people, millions of people in prisons now, because we don't want to see violence, because we believe that society isn't founded and maintained by violence. And so there is this sense that and it comes down to these inversions with war and so forth too, that Schmidt noted, like Clausewitz, war is what happens when talking breaks down. And Schmidt argued that, no, that's completely, but like Clausewitz had it completely backwards, that the talking that you do in Parliament is just another form of verbal combat, right? And so there's all of these ideas, and part of it comes down to this idea that we really have elided the notion that violence in a sinful world is essential to maintaining order and stability in a society, and we just don't believe that anymore. And that's part of why the border crisis escalates, is because we think that there's a nonviolent solution to it.
Well, not only that, it's the reason why someone like Abbott isn't in the position where he would get overwhelming support for the use of force. Right. So hypothetically, if Abbott acted tomorrow morning, whatever the regime might or might not do, he would not get overwhelming support from the people of Texas. Right. And the reason he would not get overwhelming support from the people of Texas is that there's a substantial portion of Western populations that have been enculturated to believe that violence under any circumstances is inherently wrong.
Yeah. As opposed to your king being given this responsibility by God. And this is why you vest it with a limited group of people, right? So now they have obligation to God, and they've been given the authority to use violence. And so there's this place for it, but it's contained, right, in society. And that's, in a sense, you might almost call it a measure of grace, that the state contains violence so that the rest of the people can live without it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, absolutely, because what you don't want, what is not Christian, and what we would call chaos, is everyone having to reestablish their own private borders by force every day. That is chaos. Well, the libertarian paradise, I guess. But.
The problem is there is no way from here to there. That is, from here, meaning where we are, here, to there, meaning the ordered hierarchy of the lesser and greater magistrates, that does not lead through that chaos.
That's correct. Yes.
So that's what we're going to get, because the scenario in which the people of Texas do support Abbott is when they don't know where the next meal for their children is coming from, and these people are the problem, or the people that have come in the past 50 years are the problem, or whatever. That's when you're going to get the people who support the violence, and in fact are going to be engaging in the violence themselves, really not caring at all what Abbott does, because that's the way it works. I mean, there's no universe in which we get back to the correct enculturation, as the Black Horse correctly says, without going down further first, because I make this point all the time, but it's a common error, I think, among people on the right, not among this group, but that somehow there's this like great reservoir virtue among people who are not on the left, just waiting to be tapped. I mean, I hate to break it to the world, but there is no great reservoir of virtue. It has to be reinculturated. And the only way to do that is through mass violence. There's just some period of mass violence. I mean, I don't like that, but, there you go.
Well, and that's exactly it, and we were joking before we came on air, and I think it's useful maybe to even just to encapsulate this, just to get the audience thinking about it, but we talk about, the Christian case for machine gunning immigrants, right? and so, but that sort of frames, it really gets you thinking about, like, what are the conditions necessary to have to really deal with this, right? Is it economic, as Charles saying, or do, like, just like you hear some of these stories of people who live in border communities where their lives are completely intolerable, and how far does this kind of chaos, even if people are still putting food on the table, where just their quality of life has diminished to the point of saying, listen, we just can't live like this anymore, and something needs to be done. And eventually you're going to have like vigilantes. If the government won't do it, we will take it. A magistrate will rise up and claim that authority and do something about it. And then you're into the case of like warlords. It's like, I'll do something about it because I can protect this small principality here.
One might say shampoo warlords.
Absolutely.
Well, we heard about that in the Guardian, that they were arising.
Well, I hear that it's the coming thing. I don't know anything about this person. But I hear
it's a very clean and sweet smelling warlord.
There will be no BO among the shampoo warlords troops.
Yeah, and the hair will be soft and fabulous.
It will be.
Getting back to Abbott really quick, he did order back in October the retaking of Fronton Island, which was the disputed island with Mexico in the Rio Grande that was hosting operational units of two cartels who were both smuggling drugs and people over the border. And without going to the feds, he used the special ops part of the Texas Rangers to go and take the island. I was unaware of this until I just doing, a little background for our stream today. So I'm actually encouraged that, this is the kind of thing that can be done that he has in his back pocket. So yeah. I'm a little more optimistic.
I think it's important to note, like, confronting the federal government indirectly on this issue is one of the best, compared to all of the other potential cases for governors confronting the U.S. federal government. This is one of the areas where they're going to have the most strength in both popular support and support among the kind of local business elite that tend to support state governors. So, if you're going to be optimistic about a confrontation, this is one to be relatively optimistic about.
Yeah, and I think the other optimistic case that I would make here is, I don't think anybody here is overly enamored with Abbott, but at the same time, Abbott, throughout the course of his governorship, has proven responsive to political trends in his state. And I would say that with these very modest steps that he's taken so far, the outpouring of acclaim, both within Texas and then nationally, has been very, very strong. So I think the optimistic case is that Abbott will find kind of increasing levels of acclaim for his actions, where he's actually stepping in and acting like a sovereign, and that he will like that and do more of it. Is essentially.
Oh, did we lose Josh?
Well, I mean, I'm always fond of quoting what Cicero said about Julius Caesar, which is that Caesar was a man of supreme daring, hardened to every danger.
Yes.
I don't think Abbott is that. Well, people can surprise you, right? And you maybe we'll wake up one day and that'll be Abbott. But you need that guy in order to deal adequately to mount a sustained and capable challenge to the regime.
Another angle of it too, to kind of marry comments from both Charles and Kuptos, is that you have the illusion of violence from the general public sphere, but that is coupled with this Gordian knot that has generally the approach most seem to have taken in the past few decades is thinking, well, if we add a couple more side knots, maybe the whole thing can eventually come undone. You untie a Gordian knot with a sword. That's the only way you untie it. And what the sword, lethal, sublethal force applied by the state of Texas, what it might come to display would be the regime's tendency or willingness to bend the sword unto states before it does so unto foreign actors. And so you have the implication of, oh, well, Abbott, he can't challenge the feds because then the feds might, and it's a fill in the blank, but it's a fill in the blank where everyone substitutes, well, they have F-16s and they have nuclear missiles and the feds can do whatever they want, blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of the point from the propaganda angle, is that you are forcing, by intensifying the conflict, what you eventually can do, if you can manage the optics of it, is force the more public realization of the private knowledge by many on the right that the regime is more inclined to apply violence towards its supposed enemies than its supposed friends, because the regime has a corrupted allocation of affection, morally speaking. The regime is more inclined, generally speaking, towards Central and South American nationals than the sovereignty and safety of Texans. And pushing the violence envelope can be an opportunity, I think, to cause a greater number of the common man to see that and to realize it, where if you got out the sandwich board and stood on the intersection and tried to claim it, the people are gonna lock you up and they're gonna stick you in the padded room, because that's insane. You can't say the feds want to, well, no, but you can make the feds show you that. And if you push them, what does the federal retakeover of Eagle Pass look like if the injunction doesn't go through? What do they have to fall back on? They have special operations, they have the military, they have violence, they have lethal force. And what the comedy, in a sense, the irony of the elision of violence from the common sphere is that everyone still kind of knows that it undermines everything because it's baked into humanity. So everyone is waiting for, the feds, they'll just have to clean up Texas. Yeah, they could. That's the point, is that they have violence, and we've written it off for the feds, and for the states to begin to reclaim that, they leave the regime powers few means of response that I think do not, to use some of my preferred language, it forces what is communicated by the negative space into the positive space. You don't have to say, well, by implication, the regime thinks X. You can just see it with your eyes then.
That's a really, really good point, Paul. Because you're right. Because once Abbott has stepped in and he controls that border spot, even if the injunction goes against him, he can just basically say to them, okay, make me. And then they have a choice of so then the federal government is put into that position of doing violence against other Americans to protect immigrants from another country.
Absolutely.
So then you're basically you're really highlighting that inversion and as the left says, you're forcing the contradictions and exposing the contradictions, that the federal government is really acting against the interests of its own citizens to protect foreigners. And you do that by forcing them to use violence against Americans.
So one of the other things I think is interesting in this, and thank you for allowing me to come on, especially a little bit late. I was supposed to be on the chat, but
That's
something in my
fine,
real life
Jim.
came up, is that what we're seeing is something that people on the right have been hoping for quite some time, which is essentially that the interest of local elite would diverge with the national elite. In the conversation about secession, which is something that has been big on the right for a long time, especially kind of like post the 1990s, there's always been that idea of, well, we need to force kind of a principal agent problem, where the sort of the mid-level administrators of the empire basically say, oh, it is not in my interest. I do not keep on to power by going along with what the empire central, right, the capital city, wants me to do. So what's interesting is that I think that DeSantis has done a very good job of completely and totally discrediting himself over the last several months. I'm not trying to get into that specifically, but what he did do is kind of start this trend where very early in the COVID pandemic, there was sort of this kind of back and forth game between he and Abbott trying to be the quote unquote best Republican. And I think that that's a positive thing, even if DeSantis himself has sort of embarrassed himself. And what I think that we've seen is recently there was a big headline that came out that basically says now there are more Hispanics and South Americans than white people in Texas. I don't mean to make a racial point in this, but that does mean that if you look at the demographic that tends to vote for people like Abbott, they are being engineered out of the Texas polity, right? This is very clearly a goal of liberal NGOs because Texas is a big state with a lot of electoral college votes. They want it to become a blue state. They want basically what happened to California to happen to Texas. And I think that someone like Abbott, who in his heart of heart is essentially a Chamber of Commerce Republican, realizes that if Texas becomes California, Greg Abbott is no longer the governor. And so I don't mean to lionize the man personally, but I do think that aligning the interests of politicians with our interests, right, turning the relationship between the right wing and Republicans into a client-patron relationship where they need to give us things we want instead of just saying, well, we won't be as bad as the Democrats, is a positive thing. So don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to, overly, look at this as an overly optimistic situation because taken as a whole, the last few years of immigration have been disastrous. But at the same time, this is an encouraging sign from Republicans because if you talk to the guys at American Renaissance, the VDARE guys who have been strongly anti-immigration for 30 years, they've been trying to get this to be a real issue for decades. And it wasn't till Trump initially, and now we're seeing on a local scale it actually being enforced at the point of a gun. I think that it's a tactical victory, if nothing else.
No, I think that's totally right. This is the heighten the contradictions phase of our great turning, as it were. We're just waiting to see what the result of the heightening is.
Yeah, that's very good. I think we're getting close, unless there's something really, really essential. I know, Jay, you just joined a few minutes ago, unfortunately. We've been at this for almost an hour now. So unless somebody has a couple closing remarks that they want to throw at, it's been really good chat all around.
I'm just glad that I'm alive. And back in the 80s, everything was so boring. Now we have excitement. I'm sarcastic because the 80s were awesome, but
they were.
But the fact that this is one of the taglines I have on my site is Thomas Paine, who of course Paine is not necessarily someone the right typically goes for, though many of the Revolutionary War radicals have been looking better lately. Let's put it that way. But he had a quote: "If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, so that my children may have peace." And this reflection, well applied, is sufficient to call every man to duty. So, might as well get it over with. So I'm glad we're seeing some heightening of the contradictions.
Hold the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, well, there's certainly something to that. And I realize it's a little bit rude to show up late to a conversation and then monopolize it.
It's okay.
Not at all.
There's something to that in the idea that so far the complaints of the right more broadly have gone completely unaddressed. And a big part of that is that when you're playing Cassandra, when you're saying 30 years from now, this will cause a problem, that's a very difficult sell, because someone says like, oh, well, I can have 30 years of, year over year profits. My 401k will triple. My home will be worth $1 million. What do I care? Essentially this has been what baby boomers have said. But now it is, hey, we've been telling you things are going to go poorly, and they're going poorly right now in your town. And so that's a much easier hand of cards to play. And don't get me wrong, I'd much rather be in a situation where we don't have the last 30, 40 years of decline, but we don't have that choice. And essentially, this is a very strong position to place our beliefs as a solution to an elite class that is out of answers. Very clearly, the liberal regime, the liberal establishment cannot answer these questions. Now, someone might say they don't want to, which I think is true, but there are segments of the elite that need these questions answered. And their traditional collection of think tanks and academics are not providing them solutions. And so, again, I think it's a point for cautious optimism.
Well, I get all my hottest takes from the American Enterprise Institute.
Have you been drinking, Charles? It's
It's a little early. It is a federal
It's
holiday.
Hey, it's afternoon, so we're all good, right? Yeah. But this is an interesting point that Jay makes, and for me, the things began to turn in 2008. That was when the blinders began to come off, and you begin to start asking these questions and realizing that, I think all those crazy socialists were right about NAFTA. Like in Canada, the NDPers, right? The New Democratic Party, all these crazy union bosses and NDPers were right about NAFTA. And once you admit that to yourself, you begin to, the journey starts to escalate. And then COVID hit, of course. And, now you realize that the only people doing any kind of real intellectual work are on the right. And not just like the center right, but, the deep, I guess we call it, it doesn't seem that radical when you're here, but from somebody who's not here, we look like a frightening bunch. But, this is really the groundwork. We're laying the groundwork for, in a sense, what comes next, and how do we preserve as much of what we have in what comes next, and shepherd people through that, because it's coming. And we can see why. And all of these people who were saying so, now we're paying attention to them. And they've been saying it for 150 years now, many of them. So yeah, it is, like, let's just say, it's exciting times to be alive, but at the same time, very nerve-wracking, because we all have kids, and I have like 4 grandkids, and they, hopefully they have futures, right? And that's kind of what we'd like to wish for them.
Very true.
Very true. Well, thank you. I'm going to, unless somebody has something really pressing to throw in one more thing, I'm going to end the recording, and then we can say our goodbyes.